Tonight, the first topic we explore is the life of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, a man born into wealth but forged through pain. From sickly childhood days in a hospital bed to facing down nuclear annihilation with nothing but courage and charm. JFK's story isn't just a presidential biography. It's a glimpse into one of the most mythologized lives of the 20th century. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we are working on some boring ones. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight, together. John Fitzgerald Kennedy entered the world on May 29, 1917, in the affluent Boston suburb of Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald, both hailing from powerful Irish-American dynasties. His birth seemed destined for greatness, but from the start, Jack's life was anything but easy. What the public would later see as charisma and strength was, in reality, built upon a lifetime of silent battles with illness and expectation. As a child, Jack was frail. At just 3 years old, he contracted scarlet fever, a nearly fatal disease at the time, which nearly took his life and left his immune system battered. Throughout his youth, he would suffer from chronic back pain, frequent colds, and mysterious ailments that puzzled doctors. Yet he rarely let it show. Instead of sulking, Jack used his long recoveries to read voraciously. He loved stories about heroism, adventure, and ancient history, tales that transported him far from the confines of sickbeds and sterile rooms. The Kennedy household was intense. Joe Kennedy Sr. was a towering figure, driven, ambitious, and determined to see his family rise to the pinnacle of American power. He made his fortune in finance and film, and when politics called, he accepted a diplomatic post in London. But it was always clear, the real legacy he cared about wasn't his own. It was his children's, especially his sons. Jack's older brother Joe Jr. was the star, athletic, handsome, confident. Everyone assumed he would be president one day. Jack, by contrast, was smaller, thinner, and less physically robust. But he had something even more potent: wit, curiosity, and a quiet inner resilience that grew with every hospital stay and setback. At school, Jack was mischievous and charming, but never quite top of the class, not because he wasn't smart, but because his health often pulled him away. Still, he managed to earn his way into Choate, a prestigious prep school, where he began to emerge from his brother's shadow. Teachers noted his intelligence. Classmates remembered his dry humour and keen sense of observation. No one suspected that this sickly second son would one day hold the nuclear codes or charm the world with a smile that hid decades of pain. But Jack Kennedy was learning something far more valuable than just politics or academics: how to endure. As the 1930s gave way to the storm of global war, John F. Kennedy stood at a crossroads. He had just graduated from Harvard in 1940 with a thesis-turned-bestseller titled Why England Slept, a bold analysis of British appeasement before World War II. While most sons of privilege might have used that as a stepping stone to academia or diplomacy, Jack had a different path in mind: service. Despite his chronic back problems, Kennedy was determined to fight. He used his family's influence to secure a commission in the US Navy, a move that many questioned given his physical condition. But Jack wasn't interested in watching history unfold. He wanted to shape it. And so, in 1943, Lieutenant Kennedy was sent to the South Pacific, where his quiet courage would define him. While commanding a patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack and his crew found themselves in one of the most harrowing episodes of the war. In the dead of night, a Japanese destroyer rammed their small craft, splitting it in two and throwing the men into shark-infested waters. 2 crew members died instantly, the rest clung to debris. Here's where the myth of JFK was born, not from speeches, but sweat, and grit. With his injured back screaming in pain, Kennedy swam over 3 miles towing a wounded sailor by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. For the next 6 days, he led his men through the jungle, surviving on coconuts and hope until they were finally rescued. For his leadership, Kennedy was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. But the deeper impact was internal. He had faced death and survived. He had proven himself not just to his father or his country, but to himself. The fragile boy was gone, replaced by a man who understood duty, sacrifice, and the weight of command. Returning home a war hero, Kennedy's story quickly became the stuff of legend. Reporters praised his bravery. The public fell in love with his modesty and good looks. And his father, Joe Sr., wasted no time. He saw the window wide open. If Joe Jr. had been the plan, Jack was now the destiny. The political machine would begin to turn, and it would turn with Jack at its centre. When John F. Kennedy returned from the war, he brought with him more than medals. He carried the gravitas of someone who had faced death and come out wiser. While still physically fragile, Jack had developed a quiet authority, one that people noticed instantly. His father, ever the strategist, sensed the timing was perfect. America was rebuilding, and voters were hungry for new faces, fresh voices, and war heroes they could believe in. In 1946, just a year after the war ended, Jack launched his political career by running for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th District. He was only 29 years old. Though many assumed he'd ride purely on his family name and wealth, Jack surprised them. He campaigned with intensity, shaking hands, visiting factories, and engaging with working-class citizens in ways that felt genuine. His war record earned him respect, but it was his charm and sharp intellect that won hearts. He won the election handily, stepping into the House of Representatives at a time when post-war America was redefining itself. But Kennedy wasn't content to remain a backbencher. In speeches, he questioned orthodoxies, challenged party lines, and positioned himself as a thoughtful, independent Democrat. Over 6 years in the House, Jack learned the art of politics, how to listen, when to speak, and what to avoid. By 1952, his sights were set higher. He challenged Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a Republican incumbent, for a seat in the U.S. Senate. The race was fierce, expensive, and closely watched. Jack's sisters and mother campaigned tirelessly, and his father funded a media blitz, unlike anything Massachusetts had seen. The strategy paid off. Kennedy won, defeating Lodge in a stunning upset. As a senator, Jack continued to grow in stature, but he still battled severe health issues in private: Addison's disease, a dangerous adrenal disorder, and worsening back pain. He underwent risky spinal surgeries that left him near death at one point, but the public knew almost nothing. The Kennedy mystique was carefully protected. Despite it all, Jack's political star only rose. His speeches began to echo with national ambition. He was photogenic, eloquent, and young in an era yearning for a new direction. A book deal, Profiles in Courage, won him a Pulitzer Prize, but behind the glamour he was already planning his next move. The presidency. By the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy had become one of the most recognizable figures in American politics. He was young, articulate, and polished, a refreshing contrast to the older, more conservative political establishment. Behind the scenes, he was working relentlessly. Though his health remained fragile, and his back often left him in agony, Kennedy was singularly focused on one goal: becoming President of the United States. In 1960, at just 42 years old, he officially announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. Skeptics were quick to circle. He was too young, too inexperienced, too Catholic. America had never elected a Catholic president, and anti-Catholic sentiment still ran deep in many parts of the country. But Kennedy and his campaign leaned into the criticism and transformed it into strength. "I am not the Catholic candidate for president," he famously declared. "I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic." The campaign was sharp, modern, and built for television, a medium Jack mastered with ease. His team understood optics, charisma, and the power of clear messaging. Meanwhile, his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, carried a reputation for political cunning, but lacked Kennedy's calm magnetism. The tipping point came during the first ever televised presidential debate. Nixon appeared pale and visibly uncomfortable, while Kennedy exuded confidence, charm, and poise. For the first time, American voters weren't just listening, they were watching, and they liked what they saw. The election was one of the closest in US history, but on November 8, 1960, Kennedy emerged victorious. At 43, he became the youngest man ever elected president and the first Catholic to hold the office. His inauguration in January 1961 drew massive crowds. The speech he delivered became instantly iconic. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. To many, it felt like a new era had begun, one of vitality, vision, and hope. The Kennedy White House would soon be nicknamed Camelot, a term borrowed from Arthurian legend, evoking the sense of grace, charm, and almost mythic promise. But behind the glittering image lay immense challenges, foreign and domestic, that would test Jack's leadership to its very core, and the world would be watching. John F. Kennedy entered the White House with soaring expectations, but he quickly discovered that the presidency was far less forgiving than the campaign trail. Within just 3 months of taking office, he faced his first major test, and it would become one of the most embarrassing foreign policy blunders in US history. The plan, inherited from the Eisenhower administration, involved a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba. The goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro, the newly entrenched communist leader just 90 miles from American shores. The strategy? Train a group of Cuban exiles, land them covertly at the Bay of Pigs, spark an uprising, and topple the regime. Simple on paper, disastrous in execution. On April 17, 1961, the invasion began, and fell apart almost immediately. Castro's forces were prepared, the Cuban population didn't rise in support, and US air support was withheld to maintain deniability. The exiles were captured or killed, and within days, the operation had failed spectacularly. The global press seized on the moment. America looked clumsy, Kennedy looked naive. Critics pounced, allies doubted, enemies mocked. And for the first time, Kennedy's calm exterior began to crack, at least behind closed doors. He was furious at the CIA, at his advisors, and at himself. He had approved the plan, and now the weight of the failure rested on his shoulders. But here was where JFK began to show a different kind of leadership. Rather than deflect blame, Kennedy publicly took full responsibility. "Victory has 100 fathers," he said, "but defeat is an orphan." His approval ratings actually rose. Americans respected the honesty, the accountability. He had stumbled, but he had stood back up. Privately, though, the Bay of Pigs haunted him. It shook his trust in military advisors and intelligence reports. It made him wary of quick solutions and overconfident planners. And it planted a seed that would bear fruit in the tense months ahead, when missteps wouldn't just cost reputation, but risk global annihilation. From that point forward, Kennedy vowed never to be blindly led again. The lesson was bitter but necessary. In the nuclear age, decisions made in secret rooms could shake the world. And next time, he'd be ready. Because next time, the world would be even closer to the edge. In October 1962, John F. Kennedy faced a moment that no American president had encountered before, the very real possibility of nuclear war. It began with photographs. High-altitude U-2 spy planes had flown over Cuba and captured unmistakable evidence. The Soviet Union was installing nuclear missile sites just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Missiles that, once operational, could strike nearly every major US city in minutes. The stakes were unimaginable. Kennedy and his advisors, known as XCOM, gathered in secrecy to decide how to respond. The military wanted immediate airstrikes, followed by an invasion. Others urged diplomacy. But JFK remembered the Bay of Pigs. He knew how quickly things could spiral when fueled by poor judgment and unchecked aggression. He chose a different path, a naval quarantine to prevent further Soviet shipments to Cuba. It wasn't officially called a blockade, because that would have been considered an act of war. But the message was clear: no more missiles, or the US would act. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. American forces went to DEFCON 2, one step from all-out war. Across the globe, people stocked bomb shelters and waited. In Washington, Kennedy kept a calm face in public, while privately battling the weight of every decision. One misstep, one misread telegram, and millions could die. Then, in a remarkable back-channel exchange, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev offered a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public US promise not to invade the island, and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy accepted. The crisis ended. The missiles were withdrawn. War was averted. The Cuban Missile Crisis became Kennedy's defining moment, not because of bold aggression, but because of careful restraint. He had stood his ground, but allowed a path for his enemy to back down without humiliation. He learned that true leadership wasn't about victory through force, but survival through wisdom. Afterward, both superpowers installed direct communication, the hotline, between Washington and Moscow. And Kennedy, more than ever, became a voice for peace. But he also knew something chilling. The world had come closer to nuclear destruction than most people would ever realize, and the clock would always be ticking. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy emerged not only as a skilled tactician, but as a president with renewed moral clarity. He had stared into the abyss and pulled the world back from it, but he knew that leading a nation wasn't just about foreign threats, it was about forging a better future at home. And so, in the final year of his presidency, Kennedy's focus shifted inward, toward justice, equality, and what he called the new frontier. At the heart of this vision was civil rights. The struggle for racial equality had long been simmering, and by 1963 it was boiling. Across the South, segregation remained entrenched. Peaceful protesters were being met with dogs, fire hoses, and violence. Kennedy had been cautious on civil rights early in his presidency, wary of alienating Southern Democrats. But events were changing him. When federal troops had to be sent to force desegregation in Southern universities, and when civil rights activist Medgar Evers was assassinated, Kennedy could no longer stay silent. On June 11, 1963, he addressed the nation. His voice was calm, but his words were revolutionary. "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue," he said. "It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution." For the first time, a sitting president fully embraced the moral argument for civil rights. That same year, the world watched as 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. It was the March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. Kennedy met with King afterward, privately supporting the march despite political risks. Meanwhile, JFK's vision expanded to other frontiers. He championed space exploration, famously declaring that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. It wasn't just about science or Cold War pride. It was about pushing the boundaries of human achievement. It was about proving what a free society could do when it dared to dream. And yet, behind the bold speeches and televised optimism, Jack's body was deteriorating. He lived with constant pain, hidden from the public eye. But he pressed forward, with charm, with hope, and with a clear sense that time, for all of us, was finite. His new frontier was just beginning. But fate had other plans. It was a bright Friday morning in Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy arrived in the city as part of a political tour to bolster support for the upcoming 1964 election. The trip was meant to be routine: motorcades, handshakes, speeches. Kennedy, alongside his wife Jacqueline, greeted the crowd from an open-top limousine, his smile beaming, the city buzzing with excitement. But within moments, that joy would turn to horror. At 12:30 p.m., when as the motorcade passed the Texas School Book Depository, shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Jacqueline Kennedy turned to her husband in confusion, her face frozen in fear. John F. Kennedy had been struck. A bullet entered through his upper back and exited near his throat. A second shot, fatal, hit his head. He collapsed into Jackie's lap as the car sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Doctors fought to save him, but the wounds were catastrophic. At 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was just 46 years old. Back in Washington, the nation fell into stunned silence. People cried openly in the streets. Schools closed. Businesses paused. For many, it felt like the very soul of America had been torn apart. The youthful, inspiring leader who had spoken of hope, space, and civil rights was gone in an instant. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One just hours later, with a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy standing at his side, still in shock, refusing to change her clothes. "I want them to see what they did to Jack," she reportedly said. The accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was arrested within hours, but just 2 days later, he too was shot and killed on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Conspiracy theories exploded. Was it the Soviets? The CIA? The Mafia? Decades later, the full truth remains debated, but one fact is indisputable: the loss was profound. John F. Kennedy's funeral was a national moment of mourning. Foreign dignitaries walked in solemn procession. A riderless horse led the way, and in the silence of Arlington National Cemetery, little John John saluted his father's casket, a gesture forever etched into America's memory. The dream of Camelot was over. The world had stopped in Dallas. In the years following his death, John F. Kennedy's life transformed from political biography into enduring myth. The man who once walked the halls of the White House became a symbol of youth, of hope, of what might have been. His presidency, though tragically brief at just over 1,000 days, left an imprint that continues to shape American identity and global politics. Many remember him first for his words: soaring, idealistic, unforgettable. "Ask not what your country can do for you" became more than a quote. It was a call to action that inspired a generation. His speeches elevated civic duty to something noble, making ordinary people feel like they were part of something larger, something historic. And in that way, he succeeded not just as a leader, but as a unifier. In foreign policy, Kennedy's greatest triumph wasn't victory, it was restraint. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, his refusal to act rashly may have saved the world. His approach to diplomacy, grounded in realism but reaching for peace, laid the groundwork for future arms control agreements and a brief thaw in Cold War tensions. His vision for space, realized years after his death, led to humanity's first steps on the moon, and that too bore his name. Domestically, his legacy is more complex. His full civil rights agenda would only pass after his death, under Lyndon B. Johnson. And yet, it was Kennedy who shifted the moral tone of the presidency, who elevated the conversation, and who stood, at last, on the side of equality when it mattered. But perhaps Kennedy's most lasting legacy isn't found in policy or politics. It's in the image. The young president, full of promise, the father playing with his children in the Oval Office, the man who endured constant pain with a smile, the leader whose life was cut short, leaving behind a haunting silence and the eternal question, what if? Today, his image adorns coins and memorials. His name graces schools, airports, and libraries. But his real monument is carved into memory, into the idea that leadership can be intelligent and inspiring, that even in a broken world, a better future can be imagined, and that sometimes the brightest lights shine the shortest. Long before espresso machines hissed and coffee shops lined every street corner, coffee began its journey in a place few people would expect, the ancient highlands of Ethiopia. Here, according to legend, a curious goat herder named Kaldi noticed something strange among his flock. His goats, after nibbling on the bright red berries of a certain wild shrub, began leaping with unusual energy, bleating and bounding through the hills like they'd been struck by lightning. Kaldi, intrigued, decided to try the berries himself. What followed, the story claims, was a burst of clarity and wakefulness that would change history, though Kaldi didn't know it at the time. Word of this magical plant spread to a nearby monastery, where monks experimented by boiling the berries into a bitter brew. They soon found it helped them stay awake through long hours of evening prayer. The bean, it seemed, had spiritual potential. Whether or not Kaldi and his hyperactive goats ever truly existed, historians agree that coffee's roots do trace back to Ethiopia. The plant, Coffea arabica, is native to the region and has grown there wild for centuries. Locals likely chewed the beans or mixed them with animal fat to create an early form of energy bite, long before brewing was ever imagined. From Ethiopia, coffee made its way across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, most notably to Yemen. By the 15th century, it had found a new identity, no longer just a stimulant, but a drink, prepared through roasting and brewing, much closer to what we recognize today. Yemeni Sufi mystics used the dark, energizing liquid to aid in their rituals, helping them stay awake during all-night chants and meditations. The drink was called kahwa, a word once used for wine, signaling the seriousness with which it was regarded. Coffee was not just a drink, it was an experience, a ritual, a bridge between the mundane and the divine. This transformation marked the beginning of coffee's long cultural journey. From a wild shrub in Ethiopia to the spiritual centres of Yemen, coffee was already more than a beverage. It was becoming a force, one that would stir minds, fuel ideas, and eventually change the world. By the 15th century, coffee had firmly rooted itself in the heart of the Islamic world. Its journey across the Red Sea brought it to Yemen, where Sufi mystics embraced it not just as a drink, but as a spiritual tool. In their dimly lit chambers, the rhythmic chanting of prayers was often accompanied by the warmth of freshly brewed kahwa. It sharpened the mind, banished drowsiness, and allowed devotees to reach deeper states of spiritual focus. Coffee, in this context, was divine fuel. From Yemen, the bean made its way north to Mecca, Medina, and Cairo, the great centres of Islamic culture. And with it came the rise of something revolutionary, the coffee house. Known as kave khane, these establishments weren't just places to sip a cup. They were the birthplaces of conversation, music, poetry, and debate. Men gathered to discuss religion, politics, philosophy, and literature. Coffee became the drink of thought, a companion to the mind. Nowhere did coffee culture flourish more brilliantly than in Istanbul, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. By the 16th century, coffee houses had become a cornerstone of urban life. Lavishly decorated, they hosted chess matches, shadow puppet shows, and intense philosophical exchanges. The Ottomans elevated coffee into an art. Roasting techniques improved, brewing methods were refined. The coffee pot, or sezve, became a common household item, but not everyone was delighted. As with all things that stir thought and bring people together, coffee attracted suspicion. Some religious scholars denounced it, likening its stimulating effect to intoxication. Forbidden under Islamic law, coffee houses were periodically banned, accused of breeding sedition and political unrest. Authorities feared that too many awake minds in one room might conspire against them. Despite these crackdowns, the popularity of coffee only grew. People smuggled beans and brewed in secret. The bans, often short-lived, were eventually lifted. The Ottoman sultans themselves became avid coffee drinkers, and serving coffee to guests became a matter of hospitality and pride. In less than a century, coffee had evolved from a monk's midnight aid to a cultural cornerstone of the Islamic world. It had sparked controversy, invited curiosity, and most importantly, it had brought people together. And that momentum was only just beginning. For centuries, the Arab world guarded coffee like a state secret. Yemeni traders carefully exported roasted or boiled beans, ensuring that no fertile seed could sprout elsewhere. They understood what they had, not just a plant, but a cultural treasure and a powerful economic monopoly. But in the 1600s, that wall of exclusivity began to crack. The first known breach came through a daring act of botanical smuggling. According to legend, an Indian Sufi named Baba Budan visited Mecca on pilgrimage and fell in love with the drink. On his return journey, he strapped 7 raw coffee seeds to his chest, hidden beneath his robe. Back home in the hills of southern India, he planted the seeds, unknowingly setting off a global transformation. Those plants would become the ancestors of entire coffee empires. At the same time, European merchants, especially those from Venice and the Dutch East India Company, were becoming deeply curious about the mysterious black beverage popular in Islamic lands. They saw opportunity and profit. Soon, coffee found its way into European ports, first in Venice, then in Marseille, London, and Amsterdam. At first, it was exotic and rare, sold by apothecaries as a medicinal tonic, believed to cure everything from gout to melancholy. But coffee didn't remain a curiosity for long. By the mid-17th century, coffee houses were sprouting across Europe, echoing their Ottoman counterparts. In London, these establishments quickly became known as penny universities. For the cost of a cup, one could engage in lively discussions with merchants, philosophers, and poets. Coffee fueled minds, sharpened wit, and became synonymous with intellectual exchange. Not everyone approved. Much like in the Islamic world, European authorities grew suspicious. Some saw coffee houses as dens of dissent. In 1675, King Charles II of England even tried to ban them, declaring that they spread false news. The public backlash was swift and loud, and the decree was quietly dropped. Meanwhile, the Dutch succeeded in cultivating coffee on the island of Java, in what is now Indonesia. This marked the true globalization of the crop, a turning point from local tradition to global commodity. Europe had fallen for coffee, and soon the whole world would follow, each culture adding its own rituals, roasts, and revolutions to the brew. By the 18th century, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a movement. In the great cities of Europe, coffee houses had become the engines of thought, dissent, and innovation. These weren't mere shops for refreshment, they were gathering spaces for the restless and the brilliant. Writers, thinkers, rebels, and traders filled them, exchanging ideas over steaming cups of dark brew. In London, over 500 coffee houses thrived by the 1700s. Each had its own personality. Some catered to artists, others to merchants, scientists, or politicians. Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley debated astronomy at one. Lloyd's Coffee House became the birthplace of modern insurance. Across the street from Westminster, Parliament members sipped coffee before heading into heated debates. Unlike taverns, which dulled the senses with ale, coffee sharpened minds and quickened speech. This was the age of enlightenment, and coffee was its liquid fuel. In France, cafes became salons of revolution. By the time the French Revolution neared its boiling point, coffee houses buzzed with fiery speeches and pamphlet reading. The famous Café Procope in Paris hosted Voltaire, Rousseau, and later, Robespierre. These places gave voice to grievances, space for new philosophies, and momentum to political upheaval. In the right hands, a cup of coffee was more powerful than a sword. Even in the American colonies, coffee began replacing tea, especially after the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Drinking coffee became a quiet act of rebellion. The Continental Congress met over coffee. Soldiers brewed it by campfire. George Washington was said to be an avid drinker. While tea was associated with British rule, coffee was becoming the drink of American independence. But what made coffee so uniquely revolutionary? It wasn't just the caffeine, though that certainly helped. It was the setting. Coffee house didn't require membership, titles, or wealth. It welcomed conversation. In a world ruled by monarchs and rigid class systems, the cafe was a democratizing force, one cup at a time. By the end of the 18th century, coffee had firmly rooted itself not just in culture, but in history. It had helped spark revolutions, inspired manifestos, and shaped the very way people gathered and thought. And still, the journey was only halfway complete. As coffee's popularity exploded across Europe, so too did the thirst for control over its production. The bitter bean, once sacred and local, now became a global commodity, and like sugar, tea, and cotton, it was swept up in the vast machinery of colonialism. The 18th and 19th centuries saw European empires racing to cultivate coffee in far-flung lands, reshaping entire ecosystems and societies to fuel the world's growing addiction. The Dutch had already made a head start, cultivating coffee successfully in Java, Indonesia, by the late 1600s. From there, coffee spread like wildfire across the colonial world. The French planted it in the Caribbean, particularly on the island of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, while the Portuguese introduced it to Brazil. Spain took it to Central America. Wherever the climate permitted, coffee followed, carried not by explorers, but by imperial ambition. But this expansion came at a price. Behind every plantation was a system of brutal labour, often enslaved, later indentured, forced to harvest beans under oppressive conditions. On the lush hillsides of Brazil and the Caribbean, fortunes were made, but at the cost of human suffering. Coffee was profit, and profit silenced conscience. Brazil, in particular, emerged as a coffee giant. By the mid-1800s, it was supplying over half of the world's coffee, a dominance it still maintains today. The sprawling plantations, called fazendas, became symbols of both wealth and inequality, powered by slavery until its abolition in 1888, the last in the Americas. Meanwhile, in Africa, coffee returned to its birthplace, but not as a homecoming. European colonizers introduced commercial plantations in Ethiopia, Kenya, and beyond, often disrupting traditional ways of life. Local farmers were pushed into cash crop economies, growing coffee for export rather than food for survival. Despite these shadows, coffee was deeply woven into the cultural fabric of these regions. In Ethiopia, the traditional coffee ceremony remained a cornerstone of hospitality. In Latin America, it became a lifeline, both economic and spiritual. By the end of the 19th century, coffee was no longer just a beverage. It was a global empire, one built on contradiction, a drink that connected continents and cultures, but also mirrored the injustices of the time. The bean had conquered the world. Now it was ready to evolve once more. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, coffee began to shift again, from a colonial export to a modern necessity. Urbanization, industrialization, and new technology transformed not just how people drank coffee, but what it meant to them. In factories and offices, train stations and street corners, coffee became the fuel of the modern worker. No longer just for intellectuals and aristocrats, it now belonged to everyone. Central to this transformation was the invention of the espresso machine. In 1901, Italian engineer Luigi Bezzera patented a method for forcing pressurized water through finely ground coffee, dramatically speeding up brewing time. What had taken minutes now took seconds. The espresso was born, dark, concentrated, and invigorating. And with it came a whole new way of drinking. Cafes in Milan and Rome became the birthplace of this revolution. Unlike the slow, thoughtful pace of Ottoman or Enlightenment-era coffee houses, espresso culture was brisk, efficient, and bold. Italians stood at counters, took their shot of espresso, exchanged a few words, and moved on. It was coffee for the modern age, fast, strong, and unapologetically direct. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, coffee was becoming the heartbeat of American life. Mass production made it accessible and affordable. In 1900, Hills Brothers began selling vacuum-packed coffee in tins, extending shelf life and expanding reach. During both World Wars, American soldiers were issued instant coffee in their rations, gritty, bitter, and beloved nonetheless. Coffee became a symbol of comfort and routine amid chaos. By mid-century, the world saw the rise of the diner, the percolator, and the break room. Coffee was everywhere, in thermoses on job sites, in paper cups on commuter trains, in kitchens humming with morning radio. It was no longer a ceremony or a luxury, it was a lifeline. But as convenience took over, something was lost. Instant coffee dominated, but often at the expense of quality. The deep, complex flavours of roasted beans were muted. For many, coffee had become background noise, a necessity rather than an experience. Still, the bean waited. Its next evolution would come not from technology or empire, but from a growing desire to rediscover its soul. A quieter revolution was brewing, one that would take coffee back to its roots, one careful pour at a time. By the late 20th century, coffee had reached near universal saturation. It was in every kitchen, office, and gas station, a dependable, if unremarkable, companion to daily life. But beneath the convenience and routine, a quiet rebellion was stirring. A movement that sought to treat coffee not as a commodity, but as a craft. Thus began what would come to be known as the third wave of coffee. Unlike the first wave, which prioritized access and mass production, or the second wave, which introduced cafe culture through giants like Starbucks, the third wave was about reverence. It treated coffee like wine, a product of terroir, care, and complexity. Small roasters, independent cafes, and curious drinkers began asking new questions. Where was this bean grown? Who grew it? How was it roasted? What flavours could be unlocked? This wave began in places like Portland, Oslo, Melbourne, and Tokyo, cities where a new generation of roasters experimented with light roasts, single-origin beans, and alternative brewing methods. Chemex, AeroPress, siphon brewers, tools once reserved for laboratories, now appeared on cafe counters, inviting drinkers to slow down and engage. Baristas became artisans. Cuppings replaced quick sips. Coffee was no longer just about caffeine. It was about experience, ethics, and education. Central to this movement was transparency and sustainability. Roasters began forming direct relationships with farmers, bypassing exploitative middlemen. Labels on bags now read like stories, details about elevation, processing methods, and tasting notes. This wasn't just marketing. It was a shift in consciousness. Coffee was no longer anonymous. It had a name, a place, a face. But the third wave also brought tension. Prices rose, tastes changed. What had once been considered good coffee, dark, rich, strong, was now challenged by floral, acidic profiles that confused traditional palates. Some saw the movement as elitist or overly precious. Others embraced it as a long overdue correction. Still, the core idea remained powerful. Coffee is more than a morning fix. It is culture, agriculture, chemistry, and art, all in one cup. And as more people discovered this, the global conversation around coffee deepened. It wasn't just about how coffee was made, it was about how it made people feel. From bean to brew, the journey was now personal, and the cup had never tasted more alive. Throughout history, coffee has been more than just a beverage. It has been a catalyst for thought, creation, and rebellion. Wherever it has gone, it has found itself at the heart of movements, revolutions, and artistic awakenings. More than wine, more than tea, coffee has been the drink of the restless mind. In the salons of Enlightenment-era Paris, it fueled the philosophies of Voltaire and Diderot. In the smoky cafes of Vienna, it inspired composers like Beethoven, who reportedly measured his morning coffee by counting out exactly 60 beans per cup. Artists, writers, and intellectuals gathered over their brews, arguing over truth, beauty, and the chaos of the world. In London, Charles Dickens and other Victorian novelists turned to coffee houses for both inspiration and observation. These places weren't quiet retreats, they were living theatres of society. As the centuries turned, the tradition held firm. In 20th century New York, coffee coursed through the veins of the Beat generation. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg and others scribbled furiously in cafes that never seemed to sleep. In Seattle, long before it became a Starbucks capital, small independent coffee shops were hangouts for grunge musicians and struggling poets, all chasing something real, something raw. Coffee didn't just accompany creativity, it accelerated it. The gentle buzz sharpened thoughts, lifted moods, and extended conversations deep into the night. Where alcohol might blur, coffee clarified. It offered a focused kind of euphoria, a feeling of being awake, not just physically, but spiritually, mentally. And then there were the revolutions. From French rebels in the 18th century to anti-colonial thinkers in 20th century Africa and Latin America, coffee houses have often doubled as unofficial headquarters for change. In Cuba, Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries drank thick cafecito in the mountains. In Algeria, resistance against French occupation brewed in smoky cafes that doubled as political salons. Coffee, served hot and black, was often the last comfort before action. Today, cafes remain creative sanctuaries. Writers with laptops, musicians with notebooks, artists sketching strangers from corners, all drawn to the atmosphere of slow time and gentle stimulation. A place where the outside world pauses, and the mind, powered by a simple bean, is free to wander. In every era, coffee has asked the same quiet question: what if? And countless minds have answered. As we sip our lattes and pour our cold brews, it's easy to forget that coffee, ancient, global, deeply loved, now faces an uncertain future. Climate change, economic inequality, and overconsumption threaten every part of the bean's journey. And yet, like the resilient plant it comes from, coffee continues to adapt, evolve, and find new ground. One of the biggest threats is environmental. Arabica coffee, the species that makes up over 60% of the world's supply, is extremely sensitive to temperature and altitude. Rising global temperatures and erratic rainfall patterns have already begun to shrink viable growing regions. Diseases like coffee leaf rust and pests like the coffee borer beetle are thriving in the changing climate, devastating farms from Central America to East Africa. In response, scientists and farmers are working together to develop more resilient strains of coffee. Hybrid plants, shaded cultivation techniques, and regenerative farming practices are being embraced in an effort to preserve both yield and quality. Still, it's a race against time and against indifference. On the economic front, coffee's global popularity often masks the reality that most coffee farmers live on the edge of poverty. Price volatility in global markets means smallholder farmers are often paid less than the cost of production. In response, there's a growing push for fair trade, direct trade, and transparent sourcing. Consumers, more informed than ever, are beginning to ask not just how their coffee tastes, but who grew it, and under what conditions. Technology is also reshaping coffee's future. From app-controlled home brewers to precision roasting algorithms. We're entering an era where science and craft blend seamlessly. Artificial intelligence is even being used to detect flavor profiles and recommend brewing methods. Yet amidst all this innovation, the heart of coffee remains the same: connection, comfort, and conversation. Culturally, we're seeing a beautiful global cross-pollination. Japanese pour-over techniques influence baristas in Paris. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies are being revived in Western cafes. Cold brew from New York finds fans in Nairobi. The world of coffee is becoming smaller, but its diversity is blooming. So where does the journey go from here? Perhaps the real future of coffee lies not just in new technologies or climate solutions, but in remembering its roots, in honouring the hands that harvest it, the rituals that preserve it, and the conversations it inspires, one cup at a time. In the wake of Rome's collapse, Europe splintered into a patchwork of warring kingdoms and vulnerable territories. The old order had vanished, and in its place rose a new one, harsh, unstable, and defined by violence. To survive in this fractured world, rulers relied on a new kind of warrior, the knight. But the first knights were not the noble, chivalrous figures we imagine today. They were hired muscle, mercenaries on horseback, clad in chainmail, loyal not to virtue, but to gold and survival. These early knights were born from necessity. The stirrup, introduced from the east, allowed warriors to fight more effectively on horseback, and the feudal system gave them land in exchange for loyalty and arms. A lord would grant a fief to a man in return for military service, and soon, armoured cavalry became the backbone of medieval warfare. Knights dominated battlefields with their speed and power, their status rising alongside their importance. Yet with that power came problems. Many knights became little more than warlords, raiding, extorting, and terrorizing local populations in the name of personal gain. Their unchecked violence troubled both secular leaders and the church. If knights were to hold such influence, they would need to be restrained, not just by law, but by ethics. Thus began the slow birth of chivalry, not as pageantry or romantic fantasy, but as a practical solution to an urgent problem. The church, eager to tame these warrior elites, began to push a new narrative. Knights were not just enforcers, they were protectors. They were to defend the faith, safeguard the helpless, and fight with honour. The Crusades played a major role in transforming the knight's image. When Christian forces marched to reclaim the Holy Land in the late 11th century, knights were painted not as mere fighters, but as sacred warriors. They bore crosses on their chests and were blessed before battle. Their swords were consecrated, their missions framed as divine duty. And so the idea of the knight began to evolve. No longer just a soldier on horseback, he became a symbol, a man bound not only by feudal ties, but by ideals. Strength, yes, but tempered with restraint. Vengeance, checked by mercy. Power, ruled by virtue. The blade was still sharp, but now it served something higher. The code of chivalry was never etched in stone, nor dictated by a single king or council. It evolved over centuries, a fusion of warrior customs, Christian morality, and courtly ideals. But even without a central document, the message was clear. A knight was to be more than a killer in armour. He was to be a model of discipline, virtue, and protection. At its core, chivalry demanded loyalty to one's lord, one's comrades, and one's word. A knight's oath, once given, was sacred. To betray it was to betray his very identity. Honour, too, was central. Not the honour of vanity or pride, but the quiet, unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when no one watched. Courage was expected, but not recklessness. A true knight was to be brave in the face of danger, yes, but also wise enough to avoid needless violence. He was to fight only when the cause was just, and only as a last resort. Humility stood alongside strength. A knight was to know his place before God, never boasting of victories or power. He was to lift others, not crush them. The protection of the weak, especially women, children, the elderly, and the poor, was not charity, but duty. The sword existed not to dominate, but to defend. Courtesy was more than table manners. It meant treating others, even enemies, with dignity. A captured foe was to be spared if he yielded. A defeated knight deserved mercy, not mockery. This restraint in war was radical for its time, and helped distinguish knights from common soldiers. Then came piety. The knight's faith was not to be mere ritual. He was to live as a servant of God, upholding Christian values both in battle and in peace. This spiritual aspect of chivalry gave the code weight. It wasn't just about human law, but divine accountability. Yet despite its nobility, the code of chivalry was often more ideal than reality. Many knights fell short, plundering villages, waging private feuds, or chasing power at the expense of principle. Still, the code endured as a moral compass, a standard by which to measure a man's worth. It asked not just, "How strong is your sword?" but "What do you fight for?" Knighthood was not granted lightly. To become a knight was a long, disciplined journey, one that shaped not just a warrior's skill, but his soul. It began in childhood, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet halls of a noble household, where boys learned first to serve before they could command. At the age of 7, a noble-born boy was sent away from his family to become a page. This was his first step toward knighthood. Life as a page was filled with discipline. He learned table manners, reading, Latin prayers, and the basics of etiquette. But it wasn't all formality. Pages also trained in physical agility, riding horses, and basic swordplay. Most importantly, they learned obedience. A knight, after all, had to follow orders before he could give them. By his early teens, the page would become a squire. This was a time of intense training, both martial and moral. Under the watchful eye of an older knight, the squire learned the art of combat, jousting, swordsmanship, archery, and care of armour and steeds. He would accompany his knight into battle, not to fight, but to serve. He cleaned weapons, tended wounds, and absorbed the code in action. In the fire of war, he witnessed both the glory and the horror that knighthood demanded. But it wasn't all about war. Squires were expected to learn music, poetry, and the refined behaviour of the court. They practised public speaking, letter writing, and the art of courtly love, the chivalric devotion to a noble lady, often idealised and unattainable. These lessons shaped the knight not only as a fighter but as a man of grace and wisdom. When the squire proved himself, through battle, loyalty, or years of steadfast service, he was finally deemed worthy of knighthood. The ceremony was solemn. He would bathe in symbolic purification, spend a night in prayer, and confess his sins. Then, at dawn, he would kneel before his lord or king, who would tap him on the shoulders with a sword, the accolade. With those silent strikes, he was no longer a boy learning the code. He was the code, alive and armoured. Becoming a knight was more than a promotion. It was a rite of passage, filled with ritual, symbolism, and sacred meaning. At a time when most of the world was ruled by violence and uncertainty, the ceremony of knighthood brought clarity, a line drawn between raw force and disciplined virtue. It was the moment a man didn't just wield a sword, he became responsible for what it was used for. The process began with purification. On the eve of his knighting, the squire would take a ritual bath, not merely for cleanliness, but to symbolise the washing away of past sins. Afterward, he dressed in a white tunic to represent purity, a red robe for courage, and a black cloak for humility, and his readiness to die in service. He would then enter a chapel for a solemn vigil. Alone or with others, he knelt before the altar, his sword resting beside him, and prayed through the night. This vigil was more than tradition. It was a final moment of reflection. When dawn came, he would no longer be a boy of service, but a man of oath. At sunrise, the formal ceremony began. A priest blessed the sword, asking God to guide its use for justice, not cruelty. A noble or king, sometimes a relative, performed the accolade, a light tap on each shoulder with the flat of a blade. With that gesture, the squire became a knight. But the words spoken mattered just as much as the steel. The knight swore an oath, to protect the innocent, to remain loyal to his lord, to uphold the truth, to defend the faith. These vows varied by region and century, but the spirit remained the same. The sword was no longer his alone. It belonged to something greater. Gifts often followed: a sword, a horse, a spurs, or even a ring. Celebrations were held, feasts thrown in honour of the newly dubbed knight. Yet amid the joy, the weight of the commitment was never forgotten. To break his oath meant more than disgrace. It meant spiritual peril. Knighthood was not granted with wealth or lineage alone. It had to be earned, and once earned, it was carried like armour, visible or not, until death. To be a knight was to live by the sword, but also to restrain it. On the battlefield, where chaos reigned and blood was cheap, the code of chivalry asked for something rare: control. Knights were trained to fight with deadly precision, but the code demanded they temper brutality with justice and vengeance with mercy. In the heat of war, this was no small task. Knights fought in brutal campaigns, crusades, border wars, and feudal conflicts where lives were measured in moments. Yet even there, chivalry held power. Knights were expected to give quarter to a defeated enemy. If a fellow noble yielded, he could be spared, taken prisoner, and ransomed rather than slain. This wasn't only compassion, it was custom. A knight's life had value, and that value was respected, even in war. The code also prohibited unnecessary destruction. Knights were discouraged from harming non-combatants, especially women, children, clergy, and peasants. The battlefield was seen as a test of strength and honour between equals, not a license for cruelty. Of course, reality often fell short. Atrocities occurred, oaths were broken, and entire towns suffered. But when that happened, even in the Middle Ages, the dishonour lingered. A knight who violated the code risked his reputation and his soul. Chivalry also governed behaviour before and after battles. A knight was expected to announce himself, display his coat of arms, and never strike a fellow noble from behind. Surprise and deception were tactics of lesser men. A true knight fought openly, giving his enemy the dignity of seeing death approach. Tournaments offered a controlled version of this ideal. In the lists, knights competed not to kill, but to demonstrate their prowess, jousting, duelling, and displaying grace under pressure. These spectacles celebrated chivalric values, reinforcing the belief that might and virtue could walk side by side. And in victory, the knight was to be gracious. He might lift his opponent to his feet, offer a hand, or even help bind wounds. Honour didn't end when the battle did. In fact, that was when it mattered most. For the knight, war was not a blood sport. It was a sacred duty. And how he fought revealed who he truly was. Though the knight was forged in battle, his identity was equally shaped by ideals far from the battlefield, by music, poetry, and the delicate dance of devotion known as courtly love. In the medieval imagination, a true knight was not only a warrior, but a gentleman, a servant of honour and beauty, particularly in the presence of noble women. Courtly love was a cultural movement that emerged in the courts of southern France in the 12th century, influenced by troubadours, poets, and the refinement of aristocratic life. It elevated romantic longing into a chivalric obligation. A knight, it was believed, should choose a lady, often married or socially unattainable, and dedicate himself to her service. Not through possession or conquest, but through loyalty, restraint, and noble suffering. This love was rarely consummated. It was idealized, spiritual, and symbolic. The lady became the muse, the knight her humble vassal. He would wear her favour into battle, a ribbon, a token, and draw strength from her image. Songs were written, poems composed, quests undertaken, all in her name. In this way, the knight's sword was guided not only by honour, but by longing. But this was more than romance. It was a code within a code, a refinement of behaviour. Courtly love demanded grace, patience, humility, and eloquence. It softened the edges of the warrior's life, reminding him that strength alone was not enough. To be truly noble, one must be gentle. Women, too, held power in this dynamic. Though they were often excluded from political and military roles, noble women could influence events through their position, their wit, and their role as guardians of chivalric standards. A lady might grant or deny her favour, offer public praise, or demand that a knight act with greater virtue. In the courtly world, her approval shaped reputations. Of course, this ideal often clashed with reality. Not every knight was noble, and not every romance pure, but the stories endured, of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, tales where love and duty collided, often tragically. In the chivalric imagination, the lady represented more than affection. She symbolized the soul of the knight, the part he fought for, longed for, and could never quite reach. While chivalry emphasized honor, restraint, and devotion, one of its deepest pillars was loyalty, not just to lords or ladies, but to one another. In a world of shifting alliances, feudal rivalries, and constant warfare, the bond between knights was more than camaraderie. It was survival. It was trust in steel and soul. Knights were rarely solitary figures. They rode in companies, served in retinues, and lived in close quarters for months, even years. In such settings, a quiet but unbreakable brotherhood often formed. These men trained together, bled together, and rode side by side into battle. Each knew that the man to his left might be the only thing standing between him and death. Loyalty to one's lord was central to the chivalric ideal. A knight's oath to his liege bound him not just to service, but to sacrifice. In return, the lord was expected to offer protection, land, and honour. This relationship, sealed by solemn vows and often witnessed by clergy, was sacred. Breaking it was not just betrayal, it was treason. But equally powerful were the informal bonds between knights themselves. Friendships forged in battlefields and tournament fields became lifelong alliances. A knight was expected to stand by his comrades, defend their names, and, if need be, avenge their deaths. Reputation wasn't built alone. It was sustained by the respect of peers. Orders of knighthood, such as the Knights Templar or the Hospitallers, took this brotherhood even further. These were religious military communities bound by strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their loyalty was to each other and to God above all else. Within these orders, the ideals of chivalry were not just practiced, they were enforced, cultivated, and turned into a way of life. This code of mutual respect extended even to enemies. It was not uncommon for knights on opposing sides to show admiration for each other's bravery, or to treat captured foes with dignity. A worthy enemy could still be a brother in arms, divided by loyalty, but united by the code. In the end, a knight's honour wasn't just measured by how he served his lord or loved his lady. It was revealed in how he stood by his brothers. When the arrows flew, the banners fell, and only loyalty remained. As the medieval world moved into the 14th and 15th centuries, the chivalric ideal faced a harsh new reality. The battlefield was changing. So was society. And while the code of chivalry still echoed in poetry and ceremony, the world it belonged to was beginning to disappear. Gunpowder was one of the first great disruptors. The invention of cannons and firearms rendered armour almost useless. A single musket ball could do what a sword could not: pierce plate steel, shatter lines, and bring down even the most skilled knight. The old battlefield, where mounted nobles clashed in glorious organised charges, gave way to distant volleys and brutal sieges. Honour meant little when death came from a faceless shot across the smoke. At the same time, the rise of standing armies and professional soldiers eroded the knight's role as the backbone of warfare. No longer did kings rely solely on feudal levies or noble retinues. Instead, they hired trained infantry and mercenaries, men who fought for pay, not for honour. The knight, once a symbol of martial virtue, began to look more like a relic of the past. Politically, the chivalric class was also under pressure. Centralised monarchies were replacing the fractured feudal system. The individual power of lords and knights was shrinking, their independence swallowed by royal authority. The old codes of personal loyalty no longer aligned with the needs of a modernising state. Even morally, the cracks were showing. Chivalry often failed to restrain ambition, cruelty, or greed. Knights sacked cities, pillaged villages, and slaughtered civilians, sometimes under the same banners that claimed to uphold virtue. The ideals of mercy and justice were often set aside for conquest and glory, and yet chivalry did not vanish. It transformed. It became legend. Through ballads, romances, and epic poems, the image of the noble knight endured. Writers like Malory and Chrétien de Troyes preserved the spirit of Arthurian valour even as it faded from the real world. In time, the battlefield forgot the code, but the heart remembered it. Not as a law of war, but as a longing. For honour over power, for purpose over pride, for something nobler than steel. Though the age of knights has long since passed, the code of chivalry didn't vanish with their armour. Its essence, honour, courage, loyalty, restraint, still lingers in the values we hold, the stories we tell, and the quiet ways we try to live with dignity. What began as a code for mounted warriors has rippled across centuries, shaping our sense of virtue and justice far beyond the battlefield. You see it in literature, where the figure of the noble knight still rides. From King Arthur to Don Quixote to modern superheroes, the archetype persists. The lone figure who stands for what is right, even when the world around him falters. The chivalrous hero is the one who fights not for conquest, but for others, not for glory, but for meaning. You hear it in language. We still speak of doing the honourable thing. We still praise knightly behaviour in those who protect the weak, who defend truth, who act with integrity when it's inconvenient. Chivalry became more than a martial code. It became a moral compass. Its influence echoes in military traditions, in ceremonial rituals, and in the way we frame leadership and service. Even modern codes of conduct, whether in professions, sports, or governance, often echo the medieval knight's challenge: to hold power without abusing it. But chivalry has also evolved. The code that once belonged to an elite class of armoured men now invites everyone. Its ideals are no longer about bloodlines or feudal oaths. They're about character. Anyone can be brave. Anyone can choose mercy over revenge. Anyone can speak the truth when it costs them something. And in a world still marred by violence, corruption, and injustice, chivalry's deeper message still matters. That strength should be ruled by conscience. That power should serve protection. That dignity isn't found in wealth or rank, but in how we treat others, especially the vulnerable. So while knights no longer ride beneath banners or swear fealty in candlelit chapels, their code survives, not as armour on a body, but as armour on the soul. And when we act with honour in quiet moments no one sees, we still carry the sword. Glass, for all its elegance and clarity, was born in chaos, from fire, sand, and chance. Long before humans understood its secrets, nature was already creating it. When lightning struck desert sand, or when volcanoes unleashed their molten fury, the extreme heat sometimes fused silica into a glossy, brittle substance, natural glass. Obsidian, jet black and razor sharp, was one of the earliest forms. To early humans, it was a gift from the gods, used for blades, arrowheads, and sacred tools. But the real story begins not with nature's accidents, but with humanity's curiosity. Sometime around 2000 BCE, in the heat-baked lands of Mesopotamia, or perhaps ancient Egypt, people discovered that sand, when mixed with the right minerals and heated to high temperatures, didn't just harden or crack, it melted. And when it cooled, it turned into something new, a glossy, colourful material, unlike anything else. The earliest man-made glass wasn't clear. It was thick, vibrant, and often opaque, shades of deep cobalt blue, earthy greens and cloudy whites. It wasn't used for windows or lenses. Instead, it was moulded into tiny beads, decorative amulets, and miniature vessels. Glass was more akin to gemstone than utility, rare, expensive, and mystical. How did they stumble upon it? Some theories suggest that ancient potters or metalworkers, experimenting with kilns, accidentally reached the right combination of heat and ingredients, perhaps mixing sand with plant ash or crushed limestone. Others believe it may have happened near coastal fires, where the intense heat of burning driftwood could melt sand laced with natural soda. Whatever the origin, it was a revelation. Unlike stone or metal, glass could take on any shape. It could reflect light. It could be coloured, patterned, or polished smooth. And it captured the imagination of the ancient world like few other materials. It was solid, yet seemed to shimmer like water, fragile, yet made from the toughest elements on Earth. The discovery of glass was not just a technical breakthrough. It was a shift in how humans saw the material world. And though they couldn't yet see through it, glass was already beginning to change how we would one day see everything. As the earliest glassmakers began to refine their methods, glass itself started to shift from a mysterious byproduct of fire to an intentional artistic creation. In the workshops of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, what had once been an accident was now being shaped, literally, into beauty. These early artisans didn't work with molten pools of clear, flowing glass as we know it today. Instead, they used a technique called core forming. A soft clay core, shaped like a bottle or flask, was dipped or rolled in hot viscous glass. While still pliable, the surface was decorated with threads of coloured glass, combed or twisted into spirals and feathers. Once cooled, the core was scraped out, leaving behind a hollow vessel. Each piece was unique. Each was painstakingly made by hand, and each was a mark of status. Colour was everything. Artisans had already learned to manipulate the hues of their creations using mineral additives. Cobalt oxide for rich blues, copper for greens and reds, and manganese for purples. The glass glowed like polished stones, sometimes rivaling lapis lazuli or turquoise in beauty. It was the jewellery of kings and priests, sacred, symbolic, and deeply prized. Egyptian tombs have revealed countless glass items, perfume bottles, inlaid amulets, and mosaic fragments that once adorned furniture or crowns. In Mesopotamia, tablets with cuneiform inscriptions recorded instructions for glass production, some of the oldest recipes in human history. These weren't just notes, they were trade secrets, protected like treasure. The Phoenicians, master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, helped spread these early glass objects far and wide. Their ships carried shimmering beads and vessels from Levantine kilns to the marketplaces of Greece, Crete, and beyond. Glass was exotic and in high demand. Still, it remained a luxury. The tools were primitive, the heat sources difficult to control. Every object was the result of intense labour, fragile in transit, and expensive to produce. This was not yet the age of glass for all. This was glass for the gods, the nobles, and the curious few. But even in these early centuries, a transformation was underway. Glass was no longer just decoration, it was becoming expression, and in the right hands, it would soon become something even more, a lens through which to change the world. Around the 1st century BCE, in the eastern regions of the Roman Empire, likely in modern-day Syria or Lebanon, a new technique emerged that would forever change the story of glass blowing. Until now, glass had been shaped with moulds, rods, or by pouring, slow, painstaking methods suited for elite art pieces. But with glass blowing, a craftsman could dip a hollow metal tube into molten glass, draw out a glowing blob, and inflate it like a balloon. By turning and shaping it as it cooled, he could form vessels in minutes that would have once taken hours. It was one of the most important technological breakthroughs in material history, not just because it sped up production, but because it changed who glass was for. Suddenly, glass was no longer restricted to palaces and temples. Thanks to glass blowing, production became faster, cheaper, and far more versatile. The Roman Empire, with its vast road networks and booming cities, became the perfect environment for this innovation to explode. Workshops sprang up from Alexandria to Gaul. Roman glassblowers made cups, flasks, bowls, jars, everyday items, now accessible to the growing middle class. Though clear glass remained difficult to achieve, they found beauty in imperfection. Bubbles, waves, and flecks became part of the design. Translucent green and amber tones became familiar across the empire. And beyond utility, the Romans were obsessed with innovation. Some craftsmen developed techniques for mold-blown glass, where patterns and inscriptions could be embedded directly into the surface. Others experimented with cutting and engraving, creating stunning cameos and decorated vessels that rivaled fine ceramics. But perhaps most remarkable of all was this. Glass, for the first time, was hollow and thin, and that meant it could eventually become transparent. This was not just a craft revolution, it was a cultural one. Glass became embedded in daily Roman life, from storing oil and perfumes to serving wine at banquets. It wasn't merely admired anymore. It was used. From a humble breath into molten fire, a new world was born. One where glass no longer sat behind locked cabinets, but passed through hands, homes, and hearts. The age of glass had truly begun. And it was only getting clearer. With the mastery of glass blowing and the expansion of the Roman Empire, glass was no longer just a material of beauty. It began to reshape how people physically saw the world. The next great leap came not in colour, but in clarity. Roman glassmakers discovered that by adding manganese dioxide during production, they could decolorize glass, reducing the greenish tint caused by iron impurities in the sand. The result? A pale, almost clear glass. For the first time in history, people could see through glass, not just at it. This gave birth to an entirely new concept, the glass window. In Roman bathhouses and villas, flat panes of glass were cast or spun and set into stone openings, letting in filtered light while keeping out the elements. These early windows were cloudy and irregular, but they changed everything. Buildings no longer had to rely solely on open air and wooden shutters. Light could now be invited indoors, softly, mysteriously, through sheets of fire-born stone. Though true transparency remained limited, the symbolism was profound. Glass wasn't just decoration or utility anymore. It became a medium of light. Centuries later, in the medieval world, this idea would explode into full artistic and spiritual expression. In the soaring cathedrals of Europe, stained glass windows became portals to the divine. Coloured with metallic oxides and assembled in lead frameworks, these windows depicted saints, stories, and heavenly visions. Light, transformed by glass, became a sacred presence, shifting through red, blue, and gold to bathe stone altars and candlelit aisles in celestial colour. These windows were more than art. They were sermons in glass, telling stories to the illiterate, capturing eternity in pigment and pain. The Gothic cathedral, with its towering spires and kaleidoscope windows, stood as a monument to both faith and craftsmanship, where stone reached toward heaven and glass let heaven in. And still, the science advanced. Glassmakers learned to flatten sheets more evenly, to polish, to grind. With every improvement, windows became clearer, lenses became possible, and glass inched closer to one of its most profound transformations, not just as a barrier or canvas, but as a tool for seeing the unseen. The age of light was dawning, and glass was the gate. As glassmakers refined their craft, an entirely new idea emerged. That glass could not only reflect and transmit light, but also bend it. This simple, invisible action gave rise to one of the most powerful tools in human history: the lens. By the late medieval period, craftsmen in Italy began experimenting with curved glass. They noticed that when shaped properly, glass could magnify letters, bring blurred lines into focus, and sharpen vision. By the 13th century, the first reading stones, convex discs placed directly over text, were used by monks and scholars to study sacred texts more clearly. From these humble beginnings came spectacles, eyeglasses, a revolution for aging eyes and learning minds. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't lost to time or failing vision. Wisdom could be preserved, extended, and passed on. In quiet monasteries and candlelit scriptoriums, glass became a quiet saviour of literacy. But this was just the beginning. In the hands of curious minds, lenses became instruments not of sight correction, but of discovery. In the 16th century, Italian scientists created early telescopes, using stacked lenses to peer into the heavens. Galileo Galilei's telescope, a simple tube of shaped glass, revealed mountains on the moon, moons around Jupiter, and truths that shattered centuries of belief. At the same time, glass was turned inward. Dutch lensmakers like Antony van Leeuwenhoek crafted microscopes, opening a hidden world beneath the eye, teeming with life. Water droplets, fabric fibres, human blood, all became landscapes of wonder. Through tiny curved windows, glass unveiled the unseen machinery of the body, the invisible forces of nature. In these moments, glass ceased to be merely material. It became an extension of the human eye, sharpening, expanding, and forever altering perception. The impact was seismic. Science exploded forward. Biology, astronomy, physics, all were reshaped by what glass allowed us to see. It turned vague theories into visual proof, questions into evidence, and curiosity into clarity. For thousands of years, humanity had stared at the stars and guessed. Now, through a lens, we could know. And so, with each grind and curve, glass didn't just shape the world, it reshaped the mind. As glassmaking advanced through the Renaissance, another quiet miracle emerged from the furnace: the mirror. With it, humanity would not only look through glass but into it, and see itself perhaps truly for the first time. Before mirrors, reflection was the domain of water, polished metals, and myth. Bronze and silver gave vague impressions, blurred and dark. But around the 14th century, Venetian craftsmen, masters of both secrecy and technique, developed a method that changed everything. They created clear, flat glass panes and coated the reverse with a thin layer of tin mercury amalgam, producing the first modern-style mirrors. These new mirrors were expensive and elusive. Only the wealthy could afford them, and Venice fiercely protected its techniques. But when a person looked into one of these flawless sheets, they didn't just see their features, they saw identity. Mirrors brought self-awareness, introspection, and an entirely new relationship between humans and their image. Artists, philosophers, and poets were enchanted. The mirror became a symbol of vanity, yes, but also of truth, illusion, and the soul. In painting, it transformed technique. Artists used mirrors to master light and realism, ushering in a new era of portraiture. In literature, mirrors reflected internal worlds: desire, doubt, the unknown. More than art, mirrors shaped psychology. People began to consider how they appeared to others. Mirrors encouraged grooming, fashion, and presentation. In a way, they taught us how to see ourselves as separate beings, individuals with a face, a gaze, a presence. And spiritually, the mirror held mystery. In folklore, it was a portal, a veil between worlds. Some believed mirrors could trap souls, or reveal truths hidden from the naked eye. Superstitions grew. A broken mirror brought 7 years of bad luck. A covered mirror guarded the house of the dead. Still, the technology spread. By the 17th century, France and Germany had broken Venice's monopoly. Mirrors became more common, and glass became not just a medium of sight, but of self. For the first time in history, we didn't just see the world with glass. We saw ourselves. And in that quiet encounter, something profoundly human stirred. Awareness, identity, and the fragile reflection of the soul. As the Enlightenment swept across Europe, bringing with it revolutions in science, reason, and aesthetics, glass began to take on a new architectural role, one that changed not just how buildings looked, but how they breathed, moved, and connected with the world around them. For centuries, buildings had been closed and heavy. Stone walls and wooden shutters kept out light and air, offering security but limiting vision. But with the growing ability to produce larger, clearer glass panes, architects began to dream differently. Glass offered transparency, literally and metaphorically. In the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthier homes began incorporating wide glass windows, turning interiors into stages for sunlight. Greenhouses, orangeries, as they were called in Europe, emerged as status symbols, where tropical plants thrived in sunlit chambers built entirely from glass and wrought iron. These were not just gardens, they were experiments in how nature and architecture could be merged. Then, in the 19th century, glass took center stage with the Industrial Revolution. New methods of mass-producing flat glass and iron framing allowed for bold, transparent structures that had never been possible before. The most famous example, the Crystal Palace, built in London for the Great Exhibition of 1851. A vast, gleaming hall made almost entirely of glass and steel, it was a marvel of modern engineering, light, open, and modular. Visitors walked beneath arching glass ceilings, awed by the way space and sunlight danced together. It was the future, shimmering and limitless. From that moment, glass became the signature of progress. Railway stations, shopping arcades, and exhibition halls embraced it. No longer just a decorative material or scientific tool, glass was now an architectural language. It spoke of modernity, clarity, and connection. But it also shifted our relationship with space. Glass let us see without being seen. It created thresholds, not barriers. Inside and outside became part of a conversation. Privacy and openness existed in tension. Through glass, buildings could invite the world in, or frame it from within. And so, the humble sheet of glass, once a rare treasure, now became a wall you could see through. A roof that welcomed light, a material that made buildings breathe. In the 20th century, glass made yet another leap, one not of beauty or architecture, but of information. With the rise of electricity, computation, and communication, glass transformed from a window of light to a medium of knowledge, powering the very devices that define modern life. It began with a quiet innovation, vacuum tubes. These glass-encased cylinders, developed in the early 1900s, were used to control electrical signals in the first radios, televisions, and early computers. Without glass, these delicate components would have been too fragile to function. It provided the sealed, sterile environment needed for electrons to dance, for sound to be amplified, for signals to move. Then came the cathode ray tube, the bulky glass heart of early television and computer monitors. It wasn't sleek, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, images flickered into life on glass screens. People gathered around glowing rectangles, seeing worlds beyond their own, live events, and visual dreams, all projected through a thin layer of coated glass. As technology raced forward, glass kept pace. In fiber optics, ultra-pure glass threads became highways of light-speed data. A single glass fiber, thinner than a human hair, could transmit massive amounts of information, from phone calls to internet streams, across continents. Glass, once a fragile surface, was now the backbone of the information age. And then, with the rise of touchscreens and smartphones, glass became intimate. Engineered glass, chemically strengthened, scratch-resistant, and impossibly thin, became the surface we carry in our pockets, tap with our fingers, and stare into for hours each day. It responds to touch, pressure, and light. It listens, it guides, it connects. We no longer just look through glass. We interact with it. We live behind it. Glass is no longer rare. It's everywhere, in the lenses of satellites and the screens in our hands, in data cables beneath oceans and solar panels on rooftops. It's not just a material. It's an interface. From molten sand to glowing pixels, glass has become the silent partner in the digital revolution. Fragile, transparent, and yet strong enough to carry the weight of the world's knowledge. As we move deeper into the 21st century, glass, one of the world's oldest materials, remains at the frontier of what comes next. Though forged from something as humble as sand, glass has continually reinvented itself, adapting to each new era's imagination. And the story is far from over. Today's scientists and engineers are exploring glass not just as a passive surface, but as an active, intelligent material. Smart glass, capable of changing opacity at the touch of a button, is already being used in modern buildings, airplanes, and even car windows. It can respond to light, temperature, or electrical signals, giving us windows that shade themselves, walls that display images, and facades that glow with data. In the realm of sustainability, glass is stepping into the role of energy harvester. Transparent solar panels, made with photovoltaic glass, can generate electricity while letting in natural light. Imagine skyscrapers whose very windows power the floors they surround. A quiet revolution, one pane at a time. In medicine, bioglass is helping regenerate bones. In space, glass ceramics protect spacecraft from the extremes of the cosmos. And in the growing field of quantum computing, ultra-pure glass environments are essential for the manipulation of qubits, the building blocks of tomorrow's digital universe. Meanwhile, designers and artists continue to push glass into the realm of poetry. It's being 3D printed, sculpted with lasers, and infused with digital code. In their hands, glass is not just material, it's expression of fragility, clarity, light, and form. And perhaps most beautifully, despite all its futuristic roles, glass has kept its ancient soul. We still look through it for light. We still hold it to our eyes to see more clearly. We still find wonder in its shimmer, comfort in its presence, and awe in its transformation, from dust to liquid to crystal. So, where does it go from here? Maybe glass will line our clothes. Maybe it will think for us. Maybe it will vanish into transparency altogether, quietly shaping the world while remaining invisible. Or maybe, just maybe, it will continue doing what it always has, helping us see more clearly. Not just the world outside, but who we are within it.